Imagine waking up not to the shrill ringing of a digital alarm, but to the deep, penetrating cold of a winter morning and the distant, rhythmic thud of an axe splitting firewood. The year is 1824. The world outside your frost-covered window is vast, untamed, and eerily quiet, save for the wind howling through the dense pine forests of early America. There is no electricity to flick on, no thermostat to adjust, and no running water to warm your hands. Life in the 1820s was a slow, deliberate, and deeply physical existence, dictated entirely by the rising and setting of the sun and the shifting of the seasons. To understand what everyday life was truly like back then, we must strip away the modern conveniences we take for granted and step into the heavy, leather boots of an ordinary American family waking up to a new day. The day always began in darkness. Long before the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of pale purple and gray, the house was already stirring. The air inside the small timber-framed home was often bone-chillingly cold. During the night, the massive stone hearth, the literal and metaphorical heart of the home, had died down to nothing but a bed of glowing red embers buried under a thick layer of soft gray ash. The very first task of the morning, a task upon which the entire household's survival and comfort depended, was to breathe life back into that fire. You would throw back the heavy, handmade patchwork quilts and step out of a bed stuffed with goose feathers or dried corn husks. The wooden floorboards underfoot were icy, often drafted by the winter wind that found its way through the tiny, invisible cracks in the walls. With a flint and steel in hand, striking a spark to catch a piece of dried charcloth, the matriarch or patriarch of the family would gently blow on the glowing ember until a small, delicate flame danced to life. Dry kindling, usually pine needles or thin slivers of cedar gathered the day before, was carefully placed over the flame. The sharp, comforting smell of wood smoke would slowly begin to fill the room, a scent that clung to every piece of clothing, every woolen blanket, and every memory of the 1820s. As the fire grew, catching on to thicker oak logs, the ambient temperature in the immediate vicinity of the hearth slowly rose, casting a warm, flickering orange glow against the rough-hewn wooden walls. But just a few feet away from the fireplace, your breath could still be seen turning to mist in the cold air. With the fire firmly established, the next immediate necessity was water. There were no pipes, no indoor plumbing, and certainly no hot showers. Fetching water was a daily chore that required a trip outside, regardless of the harsh weather. Wrapping a thick, scratchy wool shawl tightly around the shoulders, a family member would take two heavy wooden buckets and step out into the crisp, freezing morning air. The path to the well or the nearby stream was often covered in fresh overnight snow, crunching softly underfoot. If the family relied on a well, the heavy bucket had to be lowered down into the dark, echoing depths by a thick hemp rope. In the dead of winter, the surface of the water was often frozen solid, requiring a sharp, heavy strike with an iron tool to break the ice before the bucket could finally be filled. Carrying those two sloshing, freezing buckets back to the house was a quiet test of endurance, the wooden handles biting into cold, calloused hands. Back inside the dim house, the water was carefully poured into a large, heavy, black cast-iron kettle suspended over the now roaring fire on a metal trammel. This water was the lifeblood of the morning. It was used for drinking, for washing faces, and for cooking the first meal of the day. Cleanliness in the 1820s was profoundly different from our modern standards. A simple splash of cold or lukewarm water from a ceramic basin onto the face and hands was the extent of morning hygiene. Soap was a luxury, usually made right at home in a large iron pot outdoors from animal fat and lye derived from hardwood ashes. It was harsh on the skin, smelled faintly of grease and smoke, and was used sparingly. Teeth were sometimes cleaned with a frayed twig and a bit of salt or baking soda, a simple routine before the real work of the day began. Once the fire was steady and the water began to hum in the iron kettle, the immense task of preparing the morning meal began. Breakfast in the 1820s was not a quick affair of pouring cereal into a bowl or toasting a slice of bread. It was a hearty, heavy meal designed to fuel bodies for a grueling day of physical labor. The kitchen, which was usually just the area immediately surrounding the massive stone hearth, became a symphony of slow, deliberate sounds. The heavy iron skillet, blackened by years of daily use, was dragged across the iron trammels and settled directly over a bed of glowing coals. You could hear the sharp, satisfying sizzle as a thick slab of salted pork or bacon was laid onto the hot metal. The rich, savory aroma of the cooking meat would quickly overpower the sharp scent of wood smoke, filling the small house with a comforting, mouth-watering warmth. Beside the skillet, the mother or eldest daughter of the family might be mixing a simple batter of cornmeal, water, and perhaps a pinch of precious salt, preparing to bake johnny cakes or a dense loaf of cornbread. Wheat flour was expensive and often saved for special occasions, so corn was the absolute staple of the early American diet. The thick, golden batter was spooned directly onto a hot iron griddle or sometimes baked on a wooden board tilted toward the open fire. The rhythmic scraping of a wooden spoon against a ceramic bowl, the gentle crackle of the burning oak, and the soft bubbling of coffee or a cheap substitute like roasted chicory root boiling in a tin pot created a peaceful, grounding morning melody. There was no rush of modern anxiety, only the steady, necessary rhythm of sustenance. As the food cooked, the rest of the household began to tackle their outdoor morning chores. In the dim pre-dawn light, lanterns glowing softly with tallow candles were carried out to the barn. The air inside the barn was completely different from the house, thick, warm, and smelling earthy and sweet, with the scent of hay, dried oats, and the large, breathing bodies of livestock. Milking the cows was a daily, unbreakable ritual. Sitting on a small, worn wooden stool, leaning one's head against the warm flank of a gentle cow, the rhythmic swish, ping, of fresh milk hitting the bottom of a tin pail was a deeply meditative sound. It was quiet, solitary work, accompanied only by the soft chewing of the animals and the occasional stamp of a heavy hoof on the packed dirt floor. Back in the house, the family gathered around a sturdy, rough-hewn wooden table. Breakfast was eaten with simple wooden bowls, pewter spoons, and two-pronged iron forks. The meal was often consumed in a comfortable silence, out of respect for the food, and in quiet contemplation of the long day ahead. They ate the salty, crispy pork, the dense cornbread slathered with freshly churned butter, and perhaps some preserved apples brought up from the dark, cool root cellar. Every bite they took was a direct product of their own land, their own sweat, and their own careful preparation. Once the wooden plates were scraped clean, the morning was fully upon them. The sun was finally cresting the horizon, spilling long golden beams of light across the frosted fields, signaling that it was time to step out into the vast, open expanse of the 1820s American landscape. Stepping out of the heavy wooden door of the cabin, the crisp morning air of 1820s America greeted you with a profound, unbroken silence. There was no hum of distant highways, no roar of airplanes overhead, and no mechanical whir of machinery. The landscape was a vast, untamed canvas of towering pines, dormant oaks, and rolling hills blanketed in the quiet stillness of the season. For the men and older boys of the family, the day's work lay predominantly under the open sky, intimately connected to the earth and the endless demands of the homestead. One of the most constant, rhythmic sounds of the era was the steady, echoing thwack of an iron axe biting into solid wood. Wood was the absolute foundation of survival. It was the only source of heat against the bitter cold, the fuel for cooking every single meal, and the material for building and repairing the home, the fences, and the tools. Felling a tree was a slow, deliberate dance of strength and precision. A man would stand before a massive oak or hickory, his breath pluming in the cold air, and swing a heavy, long-handled axe with a practiced, rhythmic grace. The sound of the metal striking the dense wood would ring out across the empty valley, a sharp, clear note followed by a brief second of absolute quiet before the next swing. Once the tree finally groaned and crashed to the forest floor, sending up a cloud of snow and dirt, the real work began. Stripping the branches, bucking the trunk into manageable logs, and splitting them into firewood was a task that stretched over hours. The sharp scent of freshly split wood, the sweet, resinous aroma of pine, and the deep, earthy smell of oak was a constant companion to these long, solitary hours. While the men were immersed in the heavy labor of the land, the women and older daughters were engaged in an equally vital, yet profoundly different rhythm of work inside the cabin. The interior of the cabin, though dim, was a hive of quiet, constant industry. One of the most hypnotic and soothing sounds of an 1820s household was the gentle, continuous whir of the spinning wheel. Making clothing was not a matter of a quick trip to a store. It was a staggering, multi-step process that took months of dedicated labor. Sitting by the small, multi-paned window to catch the pale winter light, a woman would draw out fibers of sheep's wool or flax, her fingers moving with a deft, almost magical muscle memory. Her foot tapped a steady, heartbeat-like rhythm on the wooden treadle, keeping the large wheel spinning. The soft, repetitive shh of the wheel turning, accompanied by the gentle stretching and twisting of the yarn slipping through her fingers, created an atmosphere of deep, meditative calm. The spun yarn would later be dyed using natural elements gathered from the woods: walnut shells for deep browns, indigo for rich blues, or goldenrod for vibrant yellows. Alongside spinning, there was the endless, meticulous work of sewing and mending. Every shirt, every pair of trousers, and every woolen stocking was stitched entirely by hand. Sitting close to the hearth for warmth, a woman would push a tiny iron needle through thick, coarse fabrics hour after hour. The soft pull of linen thread, the quiet snipping of iron shears, and the occasional shift of a burning log in the fireplace were the only sounds that broke the deep concentration. This was a life where nothing was wasted, where a worn-out dress was unpicked and refashioned into a child's shirt, and where scraps were carefully saved to be pieced together into the heavy patchwork quilts that would keep the family alive during the freezing nights. It was a slow, purposeful existence, completely detached from the rush of time, anchored only by the steady completion of one necessary task after another. As the sun climbed to its highest point in the pale winter sky, the sharp bite of the morning cold softened just enough to melt the frost on the southern-facing windows. In the 1820s, the concept of lunch as a quick, light midday snack simply did not exist. Instead, the family gathered for dinner, which was the heaviest and most substantial meal of the day, specifically designed to restore the massive amount of calories burned during the morning's relentless physical labor. The preparation for this meal was a slow, continuous process that had begun hours earlier, often overlapping with the morning chores, and relied entirely on what the family had painstakingly preserved during the autumn harvest. To gather the ingredients for dinner, one had to step away from the warmth of the hearth and venture into the silent, dark storage spaces that kept the family alive through the barren winter months. A trip to the root cellar was a journey into the cool, damp earth. Beneath the cabin, or sometimes dug deep into a nearby hillside, the cellar was a quiet sanctuary of preservation. Pushing open the heavy, creaking wooden door, you would be met with the deep, rich scent of raw soil, dry straw, and aged apples. It was a dark, windowless place, insulated perfectly from the freezing temperatures above. Here, large wooden bins overflowed with hard, earthy root vegetables, turnips, carrots, parsnips, and potatoes, all carefully buried in layers of sand or sawdust to prevent them from rotting or freezing solid. Nearby stood the smokehouse, a small, tightly sealed wooden structure that permanently smelled of hickory wood and heavy salt. Inside, hanging from the thick oak rafters in the cool, dim air, were massive hams, slabs of bacon, and cured sausages. Their exteriors were hardened and darkened by weeks of slow, deliberate smoking over a smoldering fire. This preserved meat was the true currency of survival. Slicing into a cured ham revealed meat that was dense, incredibly salty, and rich with the rustic flavor of the forest. A thick portion of this meat would be carried back to the kitchen, its heavy, smoky scent clinging to the hands and clothes, to be tossed into a large, bubbling iron pot alongside the rough-chopped root vegetables. Suspended over the fire, the stew would simmer for hours, slowly softening into a thick, hearty, and deeply comforting meal. The midday meal was eaten with the same quiet reverence as breakfast. The wooden bowls were filled with the steaming, fragrant broth, radiating a heat that seeped into tired, cold bones. The family ate together at the rough-hewn table, the sounds of wooden spoons scraping against bowls, and the gentle, ever-present crackle of the hearth fire filling the room. It was a moment of profound stillness in the middle of a grueling day, a brief, necessary pause to rest aching muscles and soak in the warmth of the roaring fire. As the afternoon progressed, the brief window of daylight already began its slow, inevitable decline. The angle of the sun shifted drastically, casting long, stretching shadows across the frozen fields and creeping slowly across the wooden floorboards of the cabin. The afternoon tasks were often quieter, requiring less brute strength than the morning's heavy lifting, but they were no less essential. Men might sit by the fire or on the porch, using small, sharp knives to carve wooden pegs for repairing furniture, or carefully oiling and sharpening their heavy iron tools with a rough whetstone. The rhythmic, repetitive scraping of stone against iron, the slow, satisfying curling of wood shavings falling to the floor, and the steady, deep breathing of exhausted working dogs resting near the glowing hearth created an atmosphere of deep, undisturbed peace. The world outside was slowly preparing for sleep, and the household was naturally following its rhythm. As the brief winter afternoon slipped away, the pale sun dipped below the jagged tree line much earlier than one might expect, painting the fading sky in bruised shades of deep violet and dull orange. In the 1820s, the setting sun was the ultimate timekeeper. There was no ignoring the encroaching darkness, no flipping a switch to casually extend the daylight. The dropping temperature was a physical, undeniable force that signaled the beginning of the evening chores. The shadows inside the cabin grew long and heavy, stretching across the rough floorboards and climbing the chinked log walls, slowly swallowing the room in a thick, quiet dusk. Before the last light entirely vanished, the final outdoor tasks had to be completed to ensure the family's survival through the freezing, pitch-black night. The heavy wooden door creaked open once more, letting in a sharp gust of frigid air. The men and older boys stepped back out into the biting cold to gather the night's supply of firewood. The rhythmic, crunching sound of heavy leather boots stepping on the frozen, snow-crusted earth echoed in the absolute stillness of the twilight. Armfuls of split oak and hickory, rough against wool-mittened hands, were carried onto the porch and stacked high near the door. The sheer volume of wood required to keep a drafty cabin warm through a long winter night was staggering, and the pile had to be substantial enough that no one would be forced to brave the freezing midnight wind to fetch more. While the wood was being secured, a final trip was made to the barn. The air inside the sturdy wooden structure was intensely peaceful, insulated from the biting wind outside by thick walls and the collective body heat of the resting livestock. The animals were already settling into their nocturnal rhythms. Horses shifted their massive weight in their stalls, their hooves making soft, muffled thuds against the straw-covered floor. Cows let out low, contented breaths, their sides expanding and contracting in a slow, rhythmic lullaby. Fresh hay was tossed into the wooden mangers, producing a dry, rustling sound and releasing a sweet, earthy dust into the dim air. The heavy barn doors were then pulled shut with a solid, reassuring thud, and a thick iron latch was dropped into place, sealing the animals safely inside, protected from the cold and the unseen predators that roamed the night woods. Back inside the cabin, the true darkness of an 1820s night began to settle in. Without the sun, the only source of light was the ever-present hearth fire, its orange glow illuminating only a small, immediate semicircle in the center of the room. To push back the darkness just a little further, the family relied on handmade candles or simple oil lamps. Tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, were the most common. Striking a flint to light the woven cotton wick brought forth a small, trembling teardrop of yellow flame. The burning tallow produced a distinct, slightly greasy and smoky odor that mingled with the sharp scent of the wood fire. The light cast by these candles was incredibly dim by modern standards. It did not banish the darkness, it merely carved out tiny flickering pockets of visibility. Shadows danced wildly against the walls with every draft that slipped through the cabin. A Betty lamp, a shallow iron vessel filled with leftover grease or fish oil, with a simple wick draped over the side, might be hung from a wooden peg near the fireplace, adding another weak, sputtering source of light. Under this soft, golden, and unsteady illumination, the cabin felt intimately small and remarkably quiet, shrinking the entire world down to the four walls of the family home. With the cabin securely closed off from the freezing night, and the small, trembling flames of the tallow candles casting long, dancing shadows across the room, the time for the evening meal, or supper, had quietly arrived. Unlike the heavy, calorie-dense dinner of the midday, supper in the 1820s was a much lighter, simpler affair, meant to gently settle the stomach before a long night of rest. The large iron kettle that had simmered over the fire earlier in the day was often swung back over the glowing coals to reheat the remaining stew, or perhaps a fresh pot of corn mush was set to boil. The thick, bubbling sound of the porridge, accompanied by the metallic clink of a heavy spoon scraping against the cast iron sides, was a comforting, familiar melody that signaled the true end of the workday. Slices of dense, leftover cornbread were sometimes toasted directly on the hearthstones, absorbing a faint, smoky flavor. If the family was fortunate enough to have a good apple harvest in the cellar, wooden mugs might be filled with warm, spiced apple cider, its sweet, earthy steam curling up toward the blackened rafters. Supper was eaten with a slow, deliberate exhaustion. The physical toll of swinging an axe, churning butter, and hauling water all day left little energy for boisterous conversation. Instead, the meal was consumed in a deep, peaceful quiet, broken only by the soft clatter of pewter spoons against wooden trenchers and the ever-present hypnotic crackle and hiss of the oak logs shifting in the fireplace. Once the wooden bowls were wiped clean and set aside, the most peaceful hours of the 1820s day began. The entire family instinctively gravitated toward the hearth, pulling their simple, ladder-back wooden chairs and low stools as close to the radiating heat as they dared. The fire was the absolute center of their universe during the long winter evenings. Without the distraction of glowing screens or the constant hum of modern entertainment, the mind was allowed to slow down and wander. An elder might reach into a deep pocket and pull out a fragile, long-stemmed clay pipe. Using a pair of long iron tongs, they would carefully pluck a single glowing red ember from the ashes and press it into the bowl of coarse, dried tobacco. The soft, rhythmic puff, puff, puff that followed, releasing a cloud of sweet, rich smoke into the room, was an incredibly soothing sound. Beside the fire, catching the brightest angle of the flickering orange light, a mother or grandmother might take up her knitting. The gentle, rhythmic click-clack of smooth wooden needles weaving coarse wool yarn into thick winter stockings was a hypnotic, repetitive motion that lulled the senses. Sometimes, in this intimate, fire-lit cocoon, stories were quietly shared, tales of old harvests, quiet folklore, or memories of distant relatives. But often, the family simply sat in a shared, comfortable silence, staring deeply into the mesmerizing, ever-changing dance of the orange and blue flames. Outside the thick log walls, the 1820s night was profoundly, almost overwhelmingly dark and silent. A freezing wind might occasionally sweep down from the northern hills, whispering through the bare, rattling branches of the ancient oak trees and causing the timber frame of the cabin to groan softly in response. But inside, enveloped in the heavy scent of wood smoke, tobacco, and old wool, the family was safe, warm, and perfectly suspended in the quiet, unhurried rhythm of the era. As the evening wore on and the heavy toll of the day's labor finally caught up with tired bodies, the preparations for sleep slowly began. In an 1820s cabin, leaving the immediate vicinity of the hearth meant stepping into a biting, unforgiving cold. The bedrooms, often located in a drafty overhead loft or a small separate room away from the main fire, were practically freezing by the time night fully set in. To make the icy beds bearable, a vital and cherished piece of household equipment was brought out, the brass bed warmer. It was a long-handled pan with a pierced hinged lid, polished to a dull, comforting shine from years of nightly use. Using heavy iron tongs, a family member would carefully scoop a small pile of glowing red coals and hot ash from the dying fire and place them into the brass pan. The lid was snapped shut, and the warmer was carried swiftly into the dark, freezing shadows of the bedroom. The bed warmer was smoothly swept back and forth between the icy linen or rough cotton sheets, transferring the intense, radiating heat of the coals directly to the fabric. The sound of the smooth brass gliding over the stiff sheets, accompanied by the faint, metallic rattle of the hot coals shifting inside the pan, was a deeply comforting nighttime ritual. It left behind a small, temporary pocket of wonderful, life-saving warmth and the faint, dry scent of scorched cloth and wood ash. Once the bed was adequately warmed, the coals were carefully carried back and emptied into the main hearth, ensuring no stray spark could ever threaten the wooden floors in the dark. With the beds prepared, the final and most crucial task of the night was to secure the fire. The fire was never, under any circumstances, allowed to fully die out. Restarting a fire from scratch with freezing fingers, a piece of flint and steel in the pitch-black, frigid pre-dawn air was a miserable chore that everyone wished to avoid. Instead, the remaining glowing oak logs were pushed closely together in the center of the hearth. Then a thick, heavy layer of gray ash was carefully shoveled over the top of the embers. This precise process, known as banking the fire, starved the coals of oxygen just enough to keep them smoldering slowly, steadily, and safely until morning. As the ashes covered the last visible flame, the cabin was plunged into a deep, heavy darkness, illuminated only by a faint, ghostly red glow seeping through the mound of gray dust. Climbing into bed was a hasty, shivering retreat from the cold air. You would sink deeply into a mattress stuffed tightly with dried corn husks that rustled crisply with every slight movement, or, if the family was slightly more prosperous, a soft, yielding mattress filled with down and goose feathers. Heavy, handmade patchwork quilts, often several layers thick and smelling faintly of raw wool and dried lavender, were pulled up tightly under the chin. The sheer physical weight of the heavy blankets pressing down on tired limbs was a grounding, immense comfort, trapping the body's natural heat and creating a safe, warm cocoon against the winter drafts that slipped through the log walls. As the last tallow candle was snuffed out with a soft pinch of the fingers, the 1820s cabin surrendered entirely to the night. The only sounds remaining in the world were the slow, rhythmic breathing of the sleeping family, the subtle, creaking settlement of the timber frame as the temperature dropped, and the low, mournful howl of the midnight wind sweeping uninterrupted across the vast, untouched American wilderness. While the daily rhythm of waking, working, and sleeping dictated the general flow of life in the 1820s, the week itself was broken up into monumental, specialized tasks. One of the most sensory-rich and essential of these was baking day. Bread was not merely a side dish, it was the absolute foundation of the family's diet, the dense, calorie-heavy core of almost every meal. In a time long before commercial yeast in neat little packets or electric stand mixers, baking was a prolonged, deeply physical process that began the night before and consumed an entire day. It usually started in the quiet, fire-lit hours of the evening when a portion of the previous week's dough, a sour, bubbling, fermented starter kept alive in a special ceramic crock, was brought out to the heavy wooden table. Water, warmed slightly over the hearth, was mixed with coarse stone-ground flour, often a blend of wheat and rye if the family could afford it, or simply heavy cornmeal. The sound of a wooden spoon scraping against the thick sides of a large, hollowed-out wooden dough trough was a slow, rhythmic thud that echoed softly in the dim cabin. The dough was then covered with a clean, slightly damp linen cloth and left near the dying embers of the fire to rise in the lingering warmth overnight. By the time the family awoke the next morning, the dough would have swollen into a massive, fragrant mound, smelling sharply of yeast, warm grain, and the faint, sour tang of slow fermentation. Kneading this massive quantity of dough was a task that required the rhythmic application of full body weight. A woman would stand over the trough, pressing the heels of her hands deep into the pale, elastic mass, folding it over and pushing down again and again. The physical exertion in the chilly morning air was intense. The repetitive motion, push, fold, turn, push, fold, turn, becoming a silent, meditative trance. Flour dusted the rough wooden table, settling softly onto the floorboards and clinging to the heavy wool of her apron. Once the dough was smooth and supple, it was divided into large, round loaves and set aside in woven baskets for a final, slow rise. Simultaneously, the enormous brick bake oven, usually built deep into the masonry to the side of the main fireplace, had to be prepared. This was not a matter of turning a dial to a specific temperature. It involved building a roaring, intense fire directly inside the small brick cavern of the oven itself. Dry, fast-burning woods like pine or chestnut were used to create a furious heat that licked against the domed brick ceiling. For hours, the fire raged inside the small space, the bricks slowly absorbing the immense thermal energy. When the black soot on the roof of the oven finally burned away, leaving the bricks a clean, whitish gray, the temperature was right. The glowing coals and ashes were then meticulously scraped out with a long-handled iron peel. Finally, a wet mop, made of old rags tied to a long wooden pole, was vigorously swiped across the floor of the oven to clean away the remaining ash, creating a sudden, loud hiss and a thick cloud of pure white steam that smelled of wet stone and clean fire. The risen loaves were carefully slid off the flat wooden peel and onto the scorching hot bricks. The heavy iron door of the oven was immediately sealed shut, trapping the intense, radiating heat inside. For the next hour, a profound, agonizingly delicious anticipation filled the cabin. The smell of baking bread, rich, toasty, sweet, and overwhelmingly comforting, seeped from the edges of the iron door, pushing back the everyday sense of wood smoke and damp wool. It was a smell that promised sustenance, a scent that meant the family would be well fed and secure against the harsh world outside for another week. When the heavy door was finally opened, the golden brown, crusty loaves were pulled from the dark depths, emitting a faint, beautiful crackling sound as the blistering hot crust met the cooler air of the room. If baking day was a test of endurance against the heat of the oven, laundry day was a grueling battle against the freezing elements and sheer physical exhaustion. In the 1820s, washing clothes was not a simple chore tucked neatly into a modern machine. It was a monumental undertaking that often consumed an entire, exhausting day, usually beginning before dawn on a Monday. The process began outside, in the biting cold air, far from the comforting warmth of the indoor hearth. A massive black cast iron cauldron, sometimes holding up to 20 or 30 gallons of water, was hauled out into the yard and set upon a heavy iron tripod. Beneath it, a blazing fire of thick hardwood logs was built up until the water inside reached a rolling, furious boil. The sharp, acrid smoke of the outdoor fire mingled with the rising, thick white steam of the boiling water, creating a hazy, warm fog in the immediate vicinity of the cauldron that offered a brief respite from the winter chill. The soap used was entirely homemade, a harsh, unforgiving substance born from months of careful preparation. Throughout the year, every scrap of animal fat and grease was meticulously saved, and hardwood ashes were collected from the hearth. Water was slowly filtered through the ashes in a wooden hopper to create lye. When this highly caustic lye was boiled together with the rendered fat in the outdoor cauldron, it produced a soft, yellowish, and powerfully alkaline soap. It smelled distinctly of old grease and wood ash, a sharp, utilitarian scent that possessed none of the floral fragrances of modern detergents. This soap was tough enough to strip away layers of dirt, sweat, and wood smoke from heavy work clothes, but it was incredibly brutal on the hands of the women who used it. The heavy, soiled garments, coarse linen shirts, thick woolen trousers, and heavy canvas aprons were plunged directly into the boiling, soapy water. Using a long, smooth wooden paddle, a woman would stand over the steaming cauldron, continuously stirring, lifting, and plunging the heavy, sodden mass of clothes. The physical weight of waterlogged wool is staggering, and the repetitive motion of dragging the paddle through the thick, swirling water was back-breaking labor. After boiling, the clothes were lifted out, dripping and steaming heavily in the frigid air, and transferred to large wooden wash tubs. Here, the most arduous part of the process began. Each garment was individually scrubbed by hand against a corrugated wooden washboard. The rhythmic, grating sound of rough fabric rubbing fiercely against the ribbed wood, scrub, scrub, splash, scrub, scrub, splash, was the defining soundtrack of the day. The harsh lye soap ate away at the dirt, but it also cracked and reddened the skin, leaving hands raw and aching in the cold. Every inch of fabric had to be inspected, scrubbed, and wrung out by hand. Twisting a heavy, wet woolen blanket required the combined strength of the entire upper body, water streaming down into the tub as the fabric was wrung as tightly as physically possible. Rinsing was yet another test of endurance. The soap had to be completely removed, which meant dragging buckets of fresh, freezing water from the well or a nearby stream. Plunging raw, red hands into icy water immediately after having them in boiling steam was a shocking, painful contrast. The clothes were rinsed repeatedly until the water ran clear. Finally, the heavy, wet garments were carried in woven baskets to the drying lines, which were simply thick hemp ropes strung tightly between bare oak trees or sturdy wooden posts in the yard. Hanging clothes in the dead of an 1820s winter was a surreal experience. As the wet linen and wool were pinned to the line, the freezing air would begin its work almost instantly. Before the woman could even walk back to the house, the garments would begin to stiffen. Within an hour, shirts and trousers would be frozen entirely solid, transforming into flat, rigid boards of ice that clattered against each other with a hollow, wooden sound when the winter wind blew. The freezing process actually helped to pull the remaining moisture from the fabric, a form of freeze-drying known to every pioneer. Later, these stiff, frozen garments would be brought carefully back inside, stacked like planks of wood, and draped over wooden drying racks near the hearth to finish thawing and drying in the ambient heat of the fire. Once the clothes were finally dry, the meticulous task of ironing began. The irons of the era were exactly that: solid, heavy, wedge-shaped blocks of cast iron with a thick metal handle, often called sad irons. They were placed directly onto the glowing coals or the hot stones of the hearth until the metal was dangerously hot. Testing the temperature was a matter of practiced intuition. A woman would spit lightly on her finger and tap the iron, listening for the sharp, instantaneous hiss of evaporating moisture. A thick cloth was wrapped around the hot handle to prevent severe burns, and the heavy iron was pressed firmly down onto the wrinkled linen. The smooth, gliding sound of hot metal over stiff fabric, accompanied by the clean, sharp smell of scorched cloth and lingering wood smoke, was the final, satisfying conclusion to the exhausting cycle of laundry day. The physical effort required to push the heavy iron, combined with the intense radiating heat, made it a quiet, sweating chore, but the result was a pile of neatly folded, crisp, and perfectly clean garments, ready to face the dirt and grime of another grueling week on the frontier. While the grueling physical cycles of baking and washing dictated the broader rhythm of the week, there were darker, quieter periods that interrupted the steady hum of 1820s life. In an era completely devoid of modern medicine, no antibiotics, no corner pharmacies, and certainly no quick trips to a brightly lit emergency room, illness was a profound, ever-present shadow that loomed over every family. The sheer physical isolation of a frontier cabin meant that when sickness struck, the responsibility for healing fell entirely and heavily upon the shoulders of the women in the household. A cold, a lingering fever, or a deep rattling cough were not minor inconveniences. They were urgent, terrifying events that demanded immediate, desperate, and often ancient forms of intervention. The transition from a bustling working home to a sick room was immediate and silent. The heavy, rhythmic sounds of the axe and the washboard were immediately hushed, replaced by the soft, urgent whispering of anxious voices and the shallow, labored breathing of the patient. The central hearth, which usually roared with bright, crackling oak logs for warmth and cooking, was carefully banked down to a gentle, steady, and quiet smolder to prevent the room from becoming overwhelmingly hot or smoky. The air inside the cabin became thick and still, heavy with the sharp medicinal scents of drying herbs and the sweet, almost cloying smell of boiling honey. The first line of defense against any ailment was always the family's carefully hoarded supply of medicinal plants gathered during the brief, frantic weeks of summer and autumn. Hanging from the darkened rafters alongside the cured meats and drying seed corn were thick, dusty bundles of herbs, horehound, yarrow, boneset, and mint. These were the true apothecary of the 1820s. A woman would stand by the dim light of the fire, her worn hands expertly crumbling the dried, brittle leaves of boneset into a small iron mortar. The rhythmic grinding sound of a heavy stone pestle crushing the dry herbs, scritch, scritch, grind, scritch, was a quiet, desperate prayer for healing. This coarse powder was then steeped in a small, battered tin cup of boiling water. The resulting tea, known as a decoction, was usually dark, incredibly bitter, and profoundly foul-tasting. Boneset tea, in particular, was legendary for its wretched flavor, but it was universally trusted to break a high fever by forcing the patient into a heavy, drenching sweat.
The sound of a metal spoon gently clinking against the side of the tin cup as the dark liquid was stirred, releasing a sharp, earthy, and pungent vapor, was a sound of desperate hope. The tea would be brought to the bedside, the patient's head gently supported as the bitter liquid was coaxed down their throat. Alongside the herbal teas, poultices were a constant, messy, and necessary remedy. If the illness involved a deep, congested cough, often the precursor to pneumonia, a very real and terrifying threat in the drafty cabins, a mustard plaster was quickly prepared. Mustard seed, ground to a fine, sharp-smelling powder, was mixed with flour and just enough warm water to form a thick, pungent paste. The sharp, eye-watering scent of the mustard instantly cleared the sinuses of everyone in the room. This paste was then spread thickly onto a clean piece of old linen or cotton cloth and applied directly to the patient's bare chest. The plaster created a localized, intense, and burning heat, which was believed to draw the sickness and congestion out of the lungs. The patient would lie perfectly still under the heavy patchwork quilts, enduring the sharp sting of the mustard, while the quiet, steady breathing of the caregiver, sitting vigil in a low wooden chair beside the bed, offered a silent, grounding presence through the long, dark hours of the night. The nights in a sick room were the longest and most isolating experiences of 1820s life. The darkness pressed in heavily against the small, flickering light of a single tallow candle, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance with the feverish dreams of the patient. The deep silence of the wilderness outside was broken only by the occasional sharp crack of a freezing tree branch or the distant, mournful howl of a wolf. Inside, the caregiver would perform a slow, continuous dance of comfort. A cool, damp cloth, wrung out from a basin of fresh water, was gently pressed against a burning forehead, offering a brief, shocking relief from the fever. The soft ring, splash, pat, pat of the wet cloth was a constant, repetitive, and deeply soothing rhythm that carried them through the grueling hours until the pale, gray light of dawn finally broke the horizon, bringing with it the tentative hope of a broken fever and another day survived.
When the brutal physical demands of the 6-day work week finally subsided, the 1820s family found their rare moments of leisure not in grand entertainments, but in the quiet, fire-lit stillness of the winter evening. Without the endless distractions of modern media, entertainment was something entirely handmade, deeply personal, and inherently slow. As the brutal winter wind battered the thick log walls of the cabin, howling down the stone chimney and rattling the small glass window panes, the family would gather tightly around the radiating warmth of the hearth. The heavy, necessary chores were done for the day, and a profound, shared sigh of relief seemed to settle over the room. It was during these dark, frozen hours that the men and older boys would often turn to the slow, meticulous art of whittling. A piece of soft, fragrant white pine or a chunk of smooth, seasoned hickory, saved specifically from the summer's wood chopping, was pulled from a pocket. With a small carbon steel pocket knife that had been carefully honed on a whetstone until it was razor sharp, the carving began. The sound of the blade biting into the soft wood was a hypnotic, incredibly soothing rhythm. Shh, scrape, shh, scrape. With every slow, deliberate draw of the knife, a thin, beautiful ribbon of pale wood would curl away from the block, falling silently onto the dusty floorboards. The air would gradually fill with the clean, bright, and resinous scent of fresh pine, mingling perfectly with the deep, earthy smell of the oak fire. The carving was never rushed. Hour after hour, under the dim, flickering orange light of a single tallow candle and the glowing coals, a shapeless block of wood would slowly transform. Perhaps it was a new, smooth wooden spoon for the kitchen, or a replacement handle for a broken tool, but often it was a small, simple toy for the youngest children, a crudely shaped horse, a small wooden whistle, or a perfectly balanced spinning top. The child would sit on a low stool, their eyes heavy with sleep, watching in a trance as the wood shavings piled up around their father's heavy leather boots, mesmerized by the quiet, steady creation of something out of nothing. This deep evening quiet was merely a prelude to the most distinct and silent day of the week, the Sabbath. Sunday in the 1820s was a day of absolute enforced rest. The relentless rhythm of axes, washboards, and spinning wheels came to a complete and sudden halt. Even the landscape seemed to hold its breath. All the heavy work, the chopping of firewood, the baking of bread, and the hauling of water had been strictly completed on Saturday. When the family awoke on Sunday morning, the air inside the cabin was cold, but the atmosphere was remarkably still. Preparation for the Sabbath was a solemn, unhurried ritual. Basins of water, warmed slightly over the banked fire, were used for a more thorough washing than the rest of the week allowed. The family would then dress in their Sunday best. For most frontier families, this did not mean silk or fine lace, but rather their cleanest, most carefully mended garments. Heavy, stiff wool suits that smelled faintly of cedar chests, and plain, dark dresses with freshly ironed white linen collars were donned in near silence. The journey to the local meeting house or church was an exercise in slow, quiet endurance. If the church was far and the snow was deep, the family might hitch their heavy draft horses to a large wooden sleigh. The horses, their breath pluming like dragon smoke in the freezing morning air, would lean into their leather harnesses, their massive, hairy hooves punching through the crust of the snow with a dull, rhythmic thump, crunch, thump, crunch. The sleigh runners glided over the frozen landscape with a continuous metallic hiss, accompanied only by the gentle, muffled jingle of the harness rings. The family sat huddled together on wooden benches in the back of the sleigh, buried under mounds of thick, heavy buffalo robes and woven woolen blankets, silently watching the stark, snow-draped pines pass in a slow-moving portrait of winter. Arriving at the meeting house, the horses were tied to a post and covered with blankets. The church itself was usually a stark, unadorned wooden structure, often lacking any form of heating whatsoever. Inside, the air was as freezing as the outdoors. To survive the hours-long service, families carried small, pierced tin boxes called foot stoves, filled with glowing coals from their own hearths. These were placed on the floorboards to offer a tiny, desperate source of warmth to freezing toes. The service was a masterclass in stillness. The congregation sat on hard, narrow wooden pews, their breath visible in the freezing air. The only sounds were the rustle of heavy wool clothing as people shifted to stay warm, the occasional cough echoing loudly in the cavernous room, and the low, steady, and hypnotic baritone of the preacher delivering a long, deeply theological sermon. When it was time to sing, there were no organs or pianos.
a single voice would intone the first line of a hymn, and the congregation would slowly, mournfully join in. The sound of 50 voices singing a slow, unaccompanied, and hauntingly beautiful melody, the sound rising up to the bare wooden rafters, was a moment of profound community and spiritual reflection. It was a stark, freezing, and incredibly peaceful pause in the grueling marathon of 1820s survival, a day entirely dedicated to rest, reflection, and the quiet endurance of the American winter. As the long, grueling months of the 1820s winter finally began to lose their icy grip on the American frontier, a subtle but profound shift occurred in the atmosphere. The absolute, unbroken silence of the deep freeze was slowly replaced by the gentle, persistent melody of moving water. The heavy snowpack, which had blanketed the fields and forests in a brilliant, suffocating white for what felt like an eternity, began to recede. It turned soft and granular under the slowly strengthening rays of the pale sun. The massive icicles hanging from the rough, overhanging eaves of the cabin roof, once thick, lethal daggers of solid ice, began to weep. The slow, rhythmic plink, plink, splash of water drops hitting the thawing mud beneath the windows was the very first, deeply anticipated song of the approaching spring. It was a sound that carried the promise of warmth, survival, and the rebirth of the frozen world. However, before the ground was even fully thawed enough for a heavy iron plow to break the earth, the most eagerly awaited and intensely sweet harvest of the year commenced, the maple sugar season. In the 1820s, refined white cane sugar was an incredibly rare and expensive luxury for an ordinary family, heavily taxed, imported from far away, and tightly hoarded in small conical loaves. But for a few fleeting, magical weeks in late February and early March, the dense groves of ancient sugar maples offered a natural, abundant sweetness, provided one was willing to endure the intense labor required to extract it. The entire family, wrapped in their worn winter woolens, would venture out into the sugar bush, the designated stand of maple trees. The air was still biting cold, especially in the crisp, frosty mornings, and patches of crusty snow still covered the forest floor, crunching loudly under heavy leather boots. Using a hand auger with a sharp iron bit, a man would bore a small, precise hole directly into the thick, rough bark of a towering maple tree. A wooden spout, known as a spile, which had been carefully whittled and hollowed out from sumac or elderberry branches during the long winter nights by the fire, was tapped gently into the hole with a wooden mallet. Then came the waiting and the quiet listening. Almost immediately, a clear, watery liquid would begin to pool at the edge of the wooden spile. It would gather into a single trembling drop, hang suspended for a brief second, catching the morning light, and then fall into a handmade wooden bucket resting securely on the snow or hung from a carved wooden peg below. The sound of the very first drop hitting the empty, dry bottom of the wooden bucket, a hollow, resonant thwack, was a moment of quiet, internal triumph. As the bucket slowly filled, the sound transformed into a gentle, continuous, and highly musical splash, splash, splash. Throughout the quiet, sun-dappled forest, the collective sound of hundreds of individual drops falling into dozens of wooden buckets created a hypnotic, natural symphony. It was the literal lifeblood of the tree, rising from the deep roots, signaling the awakening of the earth from its winter slumber. Collecting this raw sap was a marathon of backbreaking work. It required a wooden yoke, carved from soft pine to fit perfectly over a man's shoulders, from which two heavy, sloshing pails of sap were suspended by thick hemp ropes. The collector would trudge carefully from tree to tree, emptying the buckets, and then carry the heavy load back to the central boiling area, known as the sugar camp. This camp was usually just a temporary open-sided shed built deep in the woods to protect the boiling fires from sudden spring rain or late snow squalls. Here, massive soot-blackened cast-iron kettles were suspended on heavy iron chains over a roaring, continuous fire. The raw sap, which looked and tasted merely like slightly sweet water, had to be boiled down drastically. It took roughly 40 gallons of sap to produce just one single gallon of thick syrup, and even more boiling to encourage it to crystallize into solid, blocky maple sugar that could easily be stored for the rest of the year. The entire atmosphere of the sugar camp was a sensory paradise compared to the stark, sterile cold of the winter cabin. The immense fire crackled, popped, and hissed, consuming massive cords of split wood, while the furiously boiling sap sent up thick, billowing clouds of sweet, fragrant steam into the cold air. The entire forest clearing smelled intensely of sharp wood smoke and warm, rich caramel, an intoxicating, heavy perfume that clung to the hair, skin, and clothing of everyone present. Because the sap ran best when freezing nights were immediately followed by warm, sunny days, the boiling process could not be stopped and often continued long into the dark night. Sitting alone by the roaring fire in the pitch-black woods, watching the bright sparks spiral up toward the canopy of bare branches, listening to the furious rolling boil of the kettles, and occasionally skimming the white foam from the surface with a long, flat wooden ladle, was a deeply peaceful, almost spiritual experience. It was an exhausted but profoundly joyful labor, a distillation of nature's hidden energy, offering a sweet, golden reward that would sustain the family's spirits and bodies through the grueling agricultural toil of the months to come.
As the sweet, smoky days of the maple sugar harvest gently faded into memory, the 1820s landscape underwent its most dramatic and vital transformation. The lingering patches of crusty snow finally surrendered to the warming sun, and the deep, impenetrable frost that had locked the earth in a state of suspended animation slowly began to release its grip. The ground, which had been as hard as solid iron for months, softened into a thick, dark, and heavy mud. This was the true arrival of spring on the American frontier. The air itself changed, losing its sharp, biting edge and taking on a soft, damp quality. It carried the faint, incredibly fresh scent of petrichor, the ancient, earthy perfume of rain meeting dry soil, and the subtle, green promise of new life waiting just beneath the surface. For the family, this shift in the weather meant the beginning of the most critical period of the year, planting season. The survival of the household through the next winter depended entirely on the seeds sown during these brief, chaotic weeks of spring. The work began in the quiet, dim interior of the barn, long before the sun had crested the horizon. The heavy draft horses, massive creatures with thick coats and broad, powerful chests, had rested through the worst of the winter, their muscles growing slightly soft. Now they were called upon to perform an astonishing feat of continuous strength. A man would step into the stall, the air thick with the comforting smells of dried oats, old hay, and warm animal bodies. He would run a stiff bristled brush over the horses' coats, creating a rhythmic sweeping sound that sent tiny dust motes dancing in the pale shafts of morning light filtering through the wooden slats. The heavy working harness, stiff from the cold and smelling deeply of oiled leather and horse sweat, was lifted from its wooden peg. The process of harnessing a massive draft horse was a slow, heavy dance of leather and iron. The thick collar was slipped over the horse's head, settling securely against the massive shoulders. The heavy leather traces were buckled into place, and the iron hames were adjusted. The entire barn echoed with the sharp metallic clinking of buckles, the heavy snap of iron rings, and the soft, snorting breaths of the animals as they anticipated the work ahead.
Leading the team out into the cool, misty morning, the farmer would guide them to the edge of the expansive, waiting field. The primary tool for this monumental task was the plow, a heavy, cumbersome implement constructed from thick oak beams and tipped with a fiercely sharp, curved iron or steel share. The horses were backed into position, and the iron rings of the doubletree were hooked to their traces with a solid, echoing clank. The farmer grasped the smooth, worn wooden handles of the plow, wrapping the long leather driving lines securely around his shoulders, binding himself physically to the immense power of the animals. With a low, clicking sound of his tongue and a gentle shake of the lines, the command was given. The horses leaned forward, their massive muscles bunching and straining against the leather collars. The thick chains pulled taut, groaning under the immense tension. And then the iron plowshare bit deeply into the virgin soil. The sound of the earth breaking open was profound and incredibly satisfying, a deep, continuous tearing sound as millennia of thick grass roots were sliced cleanly in two. As the horses pulled, the curved iron moldboard caught the soil, lifting it and turning it over in one long, unbroken, and perfectly smooth dark ribbon. Walking directly behind the plow in the newly opened furrow was a sensory experience unlike any other. The damp, freshly overturned earth possessed an overwhelming, rich, and intoxicating smell, a deep, mineral fragrance that spoke of life, decay, and endless possibility. The farmer's heavy leather boots sank slightly into the soft black loam with every step. The work fell into a deep, hypnotic rhythm. The heavy, synchronized thudding of the horse's hooves, the constant metallic jingling of the harness chains, the steady, tearing sound of the iron slicing the earth, and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the man and the beasts merged into a singular, mesmerizing symphony of agricultural labor. Mile after mile, hour after hour, they walked back and forth across the vast field, weaving a slow, dark pattern into the landscape under the vast, open sky. Once the heavy plowing was completed, the soil was harrowed until it was fine and crumbly, ready to receive the grain. Broadcasting the seed was a task of graceful, rhythmic precision. A heavy canvas sack, brimming with precious wheat or oats saved from the previous autumn, was slung over the farmer's shoulder. Walking with a measured, even pace across the newly turned dirt, he would reach into the bag, his calloused hand grasping a fistful of smooth, golden grain. With a wide, sweeping motion of his arm, he threw the seeds out across the field. The sound of the grain leaving his hand and scattering through the air was a soft, continuous whisper, shh, 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 like a gentle rain falling against dry leaves. The seeds pattered softly against the dark soil, settling into the crevices, waiting for the spring rains to coax them into life. It was a slow, deeply hopeful act, performed in the quiet, fading light of the spring evening, a silent pact made between the family, the horses, and the ancient, enduring earth.
As the frantic, desperate energy of the spring planting season gradually subsided and the crops securely took root in the dark soil, the American frontier transitioned into the heavy, languid embrace of an 1820s summer. The days stretched out, long, bright, and golden, defined by a profound, shimmering heat that seemed to slow the very pulse of the world. The relentless, back-breaking labor of clearing land and plowing fields gave way to the steady, methodical, and deeply patient work of cultivation and growth. Life settled into a quiet, sun-baked rhythm, dictated by the slow arc of the sun across a vast, cloudless sky. Close to the cabin, the kitchen garden, a vital, carefully fenced patch of earth, usually tended by the women and children, became a focal point of daily, quiet labor. It was a dense, meticulously organized chaos of survival. Tall stalks of field corn reached toward the sky, their long green leaves rustling with a dry, papery whisper in the faint afternoon breeze. Beneath the corn, broad, sprawling vines of squash and pumpkins carpeted the ground, their massive, rough leaves providing a deep, cool shade that kept the soil damp. Winding up the strong cornstalks were delicate tendrils of climbing beans. This ancient, brilliant method of companion planting, often learned from Native American neighbors, created a microclimate of mutual support. Walking through the narrow, dusty rows of the garden in the mid-afternoon, the air was incredibly thick and fragrant. Brushing against the plants released a symphony of green scents, the sharp, pungent tang of tomato vines, the cool, sweet aroma of crushed mint, and the deep, earthy smell of sun-baked dirt. The primary chore here was weeding, a slow, grounded task that required kneeling in the soft soil. The repetitive, tactile sensation of grasping a rough weed at its base and pulling it cleanly from the earth, accompanied by a soft, satisfying rip of breaking roots, was a meditative, quiet exercise. The hands, perpetually stained green and brown with plant sap and soil, moved with an unhurried, practiced grace. The soundscape of a summer afternoon in the 1820s was a masterpiece of subtle, droning tranquility. Without the mechanical roar of modern agriculture, the air was filled with the endless, rhythmic hum of thousands of honeybees and bumblebees working the heavy squash blossoms. The high-pitched, vibrating trill of cicadas, hidden high in the oak canopy, created a continuous, pulsating wall of sound that rose and fell with the heat of the day. It was a hypnotic, heavy chorus that made the eyelids droop and invited a profound physical relaxation. Often, by late afternoon, this oppressive, still heat would build to an almost unbearable crescendo. The sky, which had been a pale, dusty blue for days, would suddenly begin to bruise in the west, turning a deep, angry shade of purple and slate gray. The faint breeze would drop entirely, leaving a breathless, heavy stillness over the farm. The leaves of the maple and oak trees would turn upwards, showing their pale undersides in anticipation. Then the first distant low rumble of thunder would roll across the valley, a deep, resonant vibration that you could feel in your chest as much as hear. A sudden, sharp gust of wind would sweep through the yard, bringing with it a drastic drop in temperature and the unmistakable electric scent of ozone mixed with the deep, dusty smell of impending rain. The first heavy drops would hit the dry dirt of the yard with a loud, percussive smack, 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 kicking up tiny, fragrant puffs of dust. Within moments, the sky would open up completely. Seeking shelter under the deep, overhanging roof of the cabin porch, the family would pause their work to watch the deluge. The sound of a heavy summer downpour striking a roof made of thick, split cedar shakes was incredibly loud, but deeply, overwhelmingly comforting. It was a continuous, roaring drumbeat that drowned out all other sounds in the world, washing away the accumulated sweat and dust of the week, and turning the pale, thirsty landscape into a vibrant, glistening, and vibrant green. As quickly as the summer storm arrived, it would pass, leaving behind a profoundly changed atmosphere. The evening that followed a heavy summer rain was perhaps the most peaceful and restorative time of the entire year. The oppressive heat was entirely broken, replaced by a cool, damp, and incredibly fresh breeze. As twilight gathered, casting the farm in soft shades of indigo and silver, the family would bring their simple, ladder-back wooden chairs out onto the porch. The rhythmic, creaking sound of a wooden rocking chair moving slowly back and forth on the damp floorboards, creak, rock, was the ultimate expression of frontier relaxation. An elder might light a clay pipe, the sweet smell of tobacco smoke mingling perfectly with the scent of wet earth and rain-washed pine. As the darkness deepened, the hypnotic nighttime chorus began. Thousands of crickets and tree frogs tuned up in the wet grass, creating a pulsing, rhythmic lullaby. And then, out in the dark fields and at the edge of the silent woods, the fireflies would begin their slow, magical dance, their tiny, silent yellow lights blinking on and off, mirroring the stars emerging in the clearing sky above. It was a moment of absolute, undisturbed peace, a quiet reward for the endless labor of the day, settling the mind and body for a deep, restful sleep.
As the long, golden days of summer slowly shortened, a profound and necessary urgency crept back into the quiet rhythm of the 1820s frontier. The intense, shimmering heat broke, giving way to the crisp, crystalline air of autumn. The landscape transformed into a breathtaking canvas of burning oranges, deep reds, and brilliant yellows as the ancient hardwood forests prepared for their long slumber. This was the season of the harvest, the grand culmination of a year's worth of patient, back-breaking labor, and a time of intense, focused gathering. The survival of the family during the impending winter hinged entirely on what they could pull from the earth before the first killing frost settled over the valley. The cornfield, which had stood tall and green all summer, was now a sea of dry, brown stalks that rustled loudly in the stiff autumn breeze with a sound like ancient parchment rubbing together. Harvesting the corn was a rhythmic, sweeping task. The heavy ears, encased in their dry, papery husks, were tossed into wooden wagons. Later, in the cool, fading light of the evening, the family would gather in the barn for husking. The repetitive, tearing sound of the dry husks being pulled away, rip, crackle, snap, revealed the hard, bright yellow and red kernels beneath. The husks were carefully saved to stuff the winter mattresses, while the corn was braided together by the remaining leaves and hung from the rafters to dry completely, safe from mice and winter moisture. In the orchard, the air was heavy and intoxicating with the sweet, cider-like scent of ripe and fallen apples. Picking the apples was a careful, deliberate process to avoid bruising the precious fruit. The soft, dull thud of a heavy, perfect apple landing in a woven basket was a sound of immense satisfaction. Once gathered, the apples were sorted, The best were individually wrapped in dry leaves or paper and packed into wooden barrels to be stored in the dark, cool root cellar, where they would provide a sharp, sweet bite of summer during the darkest days of January. The rest were destined for the cider press or the drying racks. The process of drying fruit was a slow, meditative evening chore. Sitting by the newly reignited hearth fire, the women would use small, sharp knives to peel, core, and slice the apples into thin, even rings. The rhythmic wet slice, slice, slice of the blade through the crisp fruit was accompanied by the comfortable, radiant crackle of the oak logs. These apple rings were then strung onto thick linen threads and hung in long, festive garlands from the heavy wooden beams of the ceiling directly above the fireplace. Over the next few weeks, the rising heat and wood smoke would slowly dehydrate the fruit, turning the rings into chewy, concentrated bites of sweetness that would last for months, absorbing the faint, comforting flavor of the cabin's hearth. As the final crops were securely stored away, the heavy orange pumpkins carefully stacked in the cellar, the wooden bins filled to the brim with potatoes and turnips, and the smokehouse hung with freshly cured meats, a deep, settling peace descended upon the homestead. The relentless, driving anxiety of the growing season was finally over. The family had done all they could. They were prepared. One late afternoon in November, the sky would take on a heavy, flat, and bruised gray appearance. The wind, which had been playful just weeks before, now carried a sharp, bitter edge that cut through heavy wool and hurried the steps toward the thick wooden door of the cabin. That night, sitting around the roaring fire, listening to the wind howl down the stone chimney, the first snowflakes would begin to fall. They drifted down silently out of the absolute darkness, blanketing the resting fields, the quiet barn, and the split-rail fences in a layer of perfect, pristine white. The cycle of the year was complete. The cabin, once again a tiny, isolated sanctuary of light and warmth in the vast, freezing wilderness, prepared to weather another long sleep. The fire was banked with a thick layer of gray ash. The heavy quilts were pulled tight over tired shoulders, and the deep, unbroken silence of the 1820s winter reclaimed the land. In this quiet, unhurried world, stripped of all modern noise and rush, the simple rhythm of survival, of working the earth, resting by the fire, and waiting patiently for the sun, was a profoundly beautiful and grounding existence.